The Huguenots and French Wars of Religion. Huguenots were French Protestants in the 16th and 17th centuries who followed the teachings of theologian John Calvin. Persecuted by the French Catholic government during a violent period, Huguenots fled the country in the 17th century, creating Huguenot settlements all over Europe, in the United States and Africa. John Calvin. Following the Reformation, John Calvin became a leading figure in Protestantism in the 16th century, famed for his intellectualism. Calvin's approach appealed to educated Frenchmen, and followers included some of the brightest and most elite members of Catholic-dominated France, as well as prominent tradesmen and military officers. Because of the influence wielded by followers of Calvinism, it was initially tolerated by the crown. Huguenot Church. French Calvinists adopted the Huguenot name around 1560, but the first Huguenot church was created 5 years earlier in a private home in Paris. The origin of the name Huguenot is unknown but believed to have been derived from combining phrases in German and Flemish that described their practice of home worship. By 1562, there were 2 million Huguenots in France with more than 2,000 churches. The French Wars of Religion were a prolonged period of war and popular unrest between Roman Catholics and Huguenots, Calvinist Protestants, in the Kingdom of France between 1562 and 1598. It is estimated that 3 million people perished in this period from violence, famine, or disease in what is considered the second deadliest religious war in European history, surpassed only by the 30 Years' War, which took 8 million lives. Much of the conflict took place during the long regency of Queen Catherine de' Medici, widow of Henry II of France, for her minor sons. It also involved a dynastic power struggle between powerful noble families in the line for succession to the French throne, the wealthy, ambitious, and fervently Roman Catholic ducal house of Guise versus the less wealthy house of kind princes of the blood in the line of succession to the throne who were sympathetic to Calvinism. Foreign allies provided financing and other assistance to both sides, with Habsburg Spain and the Duchy of Savoy supporting the Guises, and England supporting the Protestant side led by the Cans and by the Protestant Jeanne d'Albret, wife of Antoine de Bourbon, King of Navarre, and her son, Henry of Navarre. Edict of Saint-Germain. In January 1562, the Edict of Saint-Germain recognized the right of Huguenots to practice their religion, though with limits. Huguenots were not permitted to practice within towns or at night, and in an effort to sate fears of rebellion, they were not allowed to be armed. Massacre of Vassy. On the 1st of March 1562, Francis, the second Duke of Guise, traveling to his estates, stopped in Vassy and decided to attend the Mass. He found a large congregation of Huguenots holding religious ceremonies in a barn that was their church. Some of the Duke's party attempted to push their way inside and were repulsed. Events escalated, stones began to fly, and the Duke was struck. Outraged, he ordered his men to fortify the town and set fire to the church, killing 63 unarmed Huguenots and wounding over 100. Francis claimed he did not order an attack but was instead retaliating against stones being thrown at his troops. French Wars of Religion. The Massacre of Vassy provoked open hostilities between some followers of each religion, sparking the first war of a long series of French Wars of Religion, which continued largely uninterrupted for more than a century. The Bourbons, led by the Prince of Conde, and proclaiming that they were liberating the king and regent from evil councillors, organized a kind of protectorate over the Protestant churches and began to seize and garrison strategic towns along the Loire. Although the Huguenots had begun to mobilize for war before Vassy, II used the massacre as evidence that the edict had been broken, lending further weight to his campaign, and as hostilities broke out, the edict was in fact revoked under pressure from the Guise faction. The major engagements of the war occurred at Rouen, Dreux, and Orleans. At the Siege of Rouen, May to October 1562, the crown regained the city at the cost of Antoine de Navarre, who died of his wounds. The Battle of Dreux, December 1562, saw the capture of Conde by the Guises and Montmorency, the Governor-General, by the Bourbons. In February 1563, at the Siege of Orleans, Francis, Duke of Guise, was shot and killed by the Huguenots. The Guises considered this an assassination on the orders of the Duke's enemy, Admiral Coligny, as it was outside of direct combat. The popular unrest caused by the assassination, coupled with the fact that Orleans was holding out in the siege, led Catherine to mediate a truce and the Edict of Amboise, 1563. St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Religious violence escalated again soon enough. The worst of it came as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in 1572, which saw murders of up to 70,000 Huguenots across France, under the direction of Catherine de' Medici, the regent queen and mother of King Charles IX. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, along with many other Calvinist nobles, arrived in Paris for the wedding of the Protestant Prince Henri de Navarre to the Catholic Princess Marguerite de Valois, sister of King Charles IX. On the 22nd of August 1572, 4 days after the marriage, Admiral de Coligny narrowly escaped an attempt on his life. During the night from the 23rd to the 24th of August, St. Bartholomew's Day, the Royal Council met, during which it was decided to eliminate the main Huguenot leaders. Coligny and other Protestant noblemen were assassinated at the Louvre as well as in town. This execution of a limited number of Huguenot leaders was followed by a savage massacre, which spread from town to town. Officials recruited Catholic citizens into militia groups that hunted down Huguenot citizens, indulging not only in murder but gruesome torture, mutilation and desecration of the dead. Violence and murder followed in 12 cities over a 2-month period after the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, leading to the first wave of Huguenot departures from France to England, Germany and the Netherlands. Edict of Nantes. Violence such as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre became the norm, as civilian bloodshed and military battles dragged on until the Edict of Nantes in April 1598, ending the civil war and granting Huguenots their demanded civil rights. Huguenots used their freedom to organize against the French crown, gaining political power, amassing loyal forces and forging separate diplomatic relationships with other countries. When Louis XIV ascended the throne in 1643, persecution of the Huguenots began again, escalating to the point that he directed troops to seize Huguenot homes and force them to convert to Catholicism. Edict of Fontainebleau. In 1685 Louis XIV enacted the Edict of Fontainebleau, which replaced the Edict of Saint-Germain and made Protestantism illegal. More bloodshed ensued, and over the next several years, more than 200,000 Huguenots fled France for other countries. In 1686, Louis XIV decided he wanted to prevent Huguenots fleeing to the south to Protestant communities known as the Waldensians, or Vaudois, who were settled in the Piedmont region of Italy, which was just across the border. Troops ravaged the Protestant villages, with 12,000 Protestants rounded up into camps, where most starved to death. The few that did survive were sent to Germany. Hyuga No Diaspora. The departure of the Huguenots was a disaster for France, costing the nation much of its cultural and economic influence. In some French cities, the mass exodus meant losing half the working population. Huguenots were particularly prolific in the textile industry and considered reliable workers in many fields. They were also an educated group, with the ability to read and write. Many countries welcomed them and are believed to have benefited from their arrival. Some fleeing Huguenots made their way to Geneva first, but the city could not support so many people, and only some in the clockmaking profession ended up staying there. Parts of Germany that were still recovering from the 30 Years' War welcomed the Huguenots. The city of Brandenburg went so far as to advertise their eagerness for Huguenots to settle there. Some 4,000 Huguenots settled in Berlin and are considered to have been the spark that transformed it into a major city. The most significant population ended up in the Netherlands, with Amsterdam received the most Huguenot transplants. Other cities were keen to attract Huguenots and competed to entice them, believing that the influx of skilled, literate workers could help revive their economies. Huguenots in England. The British were not friendly with French King Louis XIV, and the Huguenots were welcomed there. About 1/5 of the Huguenot population ended up in England, with a smaller portion moving to Ireland. The Huguenots are credited with bringing the word refugee into the English language upon their arrival in the British Islands when it was first used to describe them. Huguenots in America. Some Huguenots had emigrated far earlier than the mass movement in the 17th century, but many met with misfortune. A group of Huguenots traveled to an island in Guanabara Bay in Brazil in 1555 but were later captured and murdered by Portuguese troops. In 1564, Norman Huguenots settled in Florida in an area that is now Jacksonville but were slaughtered by Spanish troops following an altercation with the French Navy. Beginning in 1624, Huguenots began to arrive en masse in the New York and New Jersey area. In 1628, some moved into what would become Bushwick, Brooklyn. Others moved to New Rochelle and New Paltz, New York, as well as Staten Island. By the time of the Exodus beginning in 1685, Huguenot communities sprang up in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and South Carolina. Often, the Huguenot settlers would assimilate with existing Protestant groups. George Washington was descended from a Huguenot named Nicholas Martial. Huguenots today. The U.S. Mint in 1924 commemorated the 300th anniversary of the arrival of Huguenots into the New World with a commemorative silver coin, the Huguenot Walloon $half. For the most part, Huguenots worldwide have successfully assimilated into the mainstream culture of whichever country they settled in, and many practice a form of the Protestant religion for which they were originally persecuted. Throughout England, France, Australia and the United States, remnants of Huguenot culture, including French Protestant churches, French names of towns and streets as well as textile and winemaking traditions, endure as reminders of the Huguenots' global influence.